The house was alive with laughter, clinking glasses, and the rich aroma of Margaret's signature roast filling the air. Tonight was supposed to be a celebration, a milestone. 40 years of marriage for John and Margaret, surrounded by family who had traveled from near and far. The warmth of it all wrapped around David like a familiar embrace. He had always felt at home here. Safe, grounded. He had no idea that, in just a few short minutes, everything he believed about his life was about to shatter. It started as a whisper. David was pouring himself another glass of whiskey when he caught the low, urgent voice of his Uncle Robert from the kitchen. "You can't keep this from him forever, John. He has the right to know." David's hand froze mid-pour. His father's voice followed, sharp, desperate. "Not tonight, Robert. Not now." Robert let out a bitter laugh. "If not now, then when? When someone else tells him first." A chill crept down David's spine. His pulse quickened. He set his glass down, his body suddenly rigid. "What are you talking about?" Silence. John and Robert turned to face him, their expressions stiff with panic. Just then, Margaret entered the kitchen, holding a tray of desserts. But the moment she saw John's face, her hands trembled. The tray wobbled. "Robert," she whispered, a plea in her voice. "Don't." David's stomach churned. His gut told him that whatever this was, it wasn't small. "Will someone please tell me what the hell is going on?" Robert exhaled sharply and set his glass down. He didn't look at John. He didn't look at Margaret. He looked straight at David. "You're not their biological son." The words were a bomb, detonating in the middle of the room. David blinked. The noise from the living room, the laughter, the music, faded into static. His heart slammed against his ribs. His throat was dry. "What?" His father dropped his head. His mother's lip quivered. No one denied it. David let out a short, breathless laugh. "No, that's insane." But the silence that followed was suffocating. No one was arguing. No one was calling Robert a liar. David's stomach twisted. "No, that doesn't make sense. I look like Dad. Mom, I have your eyes. People have said it for years." Margaret's breath hitched, and John finally met his son's gaze, sorrow weighing heavy in his eyes. We adopted you," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. The words knocked the air from David's lungs. Adopted. The floor beneath him felt unsteady. His ears rang. His whole life. A lie. 38 years, he said, his voice unsteady. "For 38 years, you let me believe." He let out a humorless laugh, shaking his head. "Jesus. Who else knows?" No one answered, which meant everyone. His aunts. His uncles. Maybe even his cousins. How many times had he sat at family gatherings, surrounded by people who knew, who had looked him in the eyes and said nothing? The betrayal burned through him like wildfire. "You should have told me." His voice was low, laced with something dangerous. "I had the right to know." Margaret stepped forward, reaching for him. "David, please. We didn't tell you because we love you. Because you're our son." He recoiled, his breath sharp. "No, you don't get to use love as an excuse. Love isn't lying to someone for nearly 40 years. John swallowed hard. "We were afraid. Afraid that if we told you, you'd feel like you didn't belong." David clenched his fists. "Feel like I didn't belong?" He let out a cold laugh. "That's exactly how I feel right now." Margaret let out a strangled sob, but David couldn't look at her. His skin burned. His mind raced. He had to get out. "I need air," he muttered, turning on his heel and storming through the house. Voices called after him, but they barely registered. The walls felt like they were closing in. The moment he stepped outside, the cold air slapped him in the face, but it did nothing to cool the storm raging inside. His hands gripped the porch railing, his breath unsteady. His mind replayed the moment over and over. Not their son. Not their blood. 38 years of lies. What else had been a lie? He squeezed his eyes shut, his chest rising and falling in uneven breaths. Inside, the laughter and clinking glasses continued. But for David, the night was over. And nothing would ever be the same again. David stood frozen in the cold night air, his breath unsteady, his chest tight with emotions he couldn't yet name. The revelation had hit him like a sledgehammer, leaving him winded, shaken to his core. But he needed answers. He turned on his heel and stormed back inside, his pulse pounding in his ears. The warmth of the house, the lingering scent of dinner, the familiar hum of conversation, it all felt foreign now, like he had stepped into someone else's life. His parents were still in the kitchen, standing in tense silence. His mother, Margaret, had a hand pressed to her mouth, her eyes brimming with tears. His father, John, stood stiff, his shoulders hunched, looking like he had aged 10 years in mere minutes. David's voice came out rough, uneven. "Tell me it's not true." Margaret let out a strangled sob. "David, tell me," he demanded, his voice rising. "Tell me Robert was lying. Tell me I'm your son." Silence. Margaret's lips trembled, her face crumpling as she broke down in tears. John reached for her, but she pulled away, her entire body shaking. David felt the floor shift beneath him. His mother, the woman who had tucked him in at night, who had bandaged his scraped knees, who had whispered, "I love you," 1,000,000 times, couldn't look him in the eye. That was all the answer he needed. The breath rushed from his lungs like a punch to the gut. He staggered back, gripping the edge of the counter for support. John finally spoke, his voice hoarse. "We wanted to tell you, son. We did." David let out a humorless laugh, shaking his head. When I turned 50, 60? Or were you just never going to tell me at all?" Margaret wiped at her tears, shaking her head frantically. "No, David, it wasn't like that. We didn't want to lie to you. We didn't know how to tell you." David clenched his jaw, his stomach twisting into knots. "You didn't know how?" His voice cracked. "You had 38 years to figure it out." Margaret sobbed harder, and John exhaled, rubbing a tired hand over his face. "You have to understand," John said, his voice pleading. "We never wanted you to feel like you weren't ours. Because you were ours, David. Blood doesn't change that." David recoiled. Blood. His father said the word so easily, as if it didn't matter. But it did. It did matter. Because his entire identity had just been ripped out from under him. He felt unsteady, like a man standing on a bridge that had suddenly disappeared. "Tell me everything." His voice was low now, raw. Margaret sniffled, nodding shakily. She pulled out a chair and sank into it, wringing her hands together like she was trying to hold herself together. John sat beside her, but David remained standing, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, like he needed to physically hold himself together. Margaret took a deep, shaky breath. 38 years ago, she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "Your father and I were struggling to have a child. We tried for years, but it never happened. The doctors told us it was unlikely I could conceive. We were devastated." David swallowed, his throat tight. Then, one night, we got a call from a woman we knew, someone who worked at the hospital. There was a baby, an abandoned baby, a little boy who had been left behind. A tremor went through David. "You," Margaret whispered, tears slipping down her cheeks. "You were that baby, David." He sucked in a breath, his chest tight. "We were told that your birth mother had left. No name, no information. Just gone. And the hospital was looking for someone to take you in before you were sent into the system." Margaret reached for his hand, but he stepped back. "We held you for the first time, and we just knew," she continued, her voice breaking. "We knew you were meant to be ours. We loved you the moment we saw you." David's breath came fast and uneven. "And you never told me." Margaret broke down completely, her face crumpling. "We were scared," she admitted. "Scared that if you knew, you would feel different. Like you weren't truly ours. And you were ours, David. In every way that mattered." David shook his head, stepping away from them. "But I wasn't yours." His voice was barely a whisper. "Not really." John stood up suddenly, his voice firm. "That's not true." David laughed bitterly. "Then why lie? If it didn't matter, why lie?" Neither of them had an answer for that. David felt his throat tighten again, his emotions a tangled mess of grief, anger, and complete, crushing loss. For 38 years, he had believed in something that had never been real. His childhood, his family, his name. All of it was built on a foundation of secrets. And now, he didn't know who he was anymore. David had spent the past 38 years believing he knew who he was. Now, that certainty had been ripped away, leaving behind a void filled with unanswered questions. He couldn't just move on, he needed to know where he came from. Who he truly was. The realization gnawed at him every waking moment. He tried to go about his normal routine, but nothing felt normal anymore. Every glance in the mirror, every childhood memory, every family photograph, it was all tainted by the truth. He wasn't their son. Not by blood. And if he wasn't David Carter, then who the hell was he? One night, unable to take the weight of it any longer, he called his best friend, Jake. "I need to find them," David said, gripping his phone tightly. His voice was raw, exhausted. "I can't let this go." Jake didn't hesitate. "Then let's do it." That was why David had always trusted him, because Jake never questioned why. He just showed up. Together, they started digging. The first clue came from Margaret. Despite the pain, she had given him what little she knew: the hospital where he had been abandoned, the approximate date he had been left there, and the woman, a former nurse, who had originally made the call to his parents about him. David hadn't spoken much to Margaret since the night of the revelation. He was still too angry, too raw. But he could tell that this was her way of making things right, by helping him find the truth. With that information, David and Jake tracked down the retired nurse, a woman named Evelyn Walker, who now lived in a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of town. They drove to her house, an old brick home with wind chimes tinkling softly in the evening breeze. Evelyn was in her 70s now, but her eyes were still sharp, still filled with the weight of secrets. "I remember you," she said softly when David explained who he was. His breath caught. "You do?" She nodded, looking at him with something between sorrow and relief. "You were just a baby. A beautiful baby boy." She let out a sigh. "I was working that night. I saw her, your mother. She was young, terrified. She came in alone, wouldn't give her name, wouldn't fill out any forms. She just left you there." David's chest tightened. "Did she say anything? Anything at all?" Evelyn hesitated before nodding. "She told me she was sorry. That she had no choice." The words hit him hard. No choice. What did that mean? Evelyn frowned in thought, then disappeared into another room. When she returned, she held an old, yellowed hospital log. "I wasn't supposed to keep this," she admitted. "But something about that night stayed with me." She flipped through the pages and stopped on a single entry. Female. Late teens. Brown hair. Green eyes. No name given. Then, in the final column, a note barely legible from years of fading ink. "From Ashwood." David's pulse pounded in his ears. "Ashwood," he repeated. Evelyn nodded. "A small town about 3 hours from here." David turned to Jake, his decision already made. "We're going." The road to Ashwood felt longer than 3 hours. David gripped the steering wheel, his mind racing with possibilities. Who was she? Did she regret leaving him? Was she even still alive? Jake, sensing his turmoil, broke the silence. "Whatever happens, man, you're not doing this alone." David nodded, but the truth was this journey was his. No matter what he found at the end of it, the weight of it belonged to him alone. They arrived in Ashwood late in the afternoon, the kind of small town where everyone seemed to know each other. It wasn't hard to find people willing to talk, especially when David showed the hospital record and described the woman Evelyn had seen that night. And that was how he found her. Helen Dawson, a woman who, 38 years ago, had lost, or abandoned, her son. David stood outside the modest house on the edge of town, his heart hammering against his ribs. The porch light was on, casting a soft glow against the falling dusk. He could see movement inside, a shadow passing by the window. Jake put a hand on his shoulder. "You sure about this?" David swallowed hard. "No." But he knocked anyway. David's heart pounded as he stood on the porch, staring at the door of the modest house before him. His hands were clammy, his breath uneven. He had spent his entire life not knowing this woman, and yet, in a few moments, she might change everything he thought he understood about himself. With one last deep breath, he knocked. The seconds stretched unbearably long before the door creaked open. A woman stood before him, older now, her brown hair streaked with gray, her face lined with years of hardship. But it was her eyes that struck him. Deep green, filled with a mixture of shock, fear, and something else, recognition. David felt like the ground beneath him shifted. "Are you Helen Dawson?" His voice was steady, but his hands clenched at his sides. She swallowed, her gaze locked onto his face, searching. "Who's asking?" David opened his mouth, but the words caught in his throat. What was he supposed to say? "I think I'm your son?" Jake, standing a few feet behind him, cleared his throat. "Ma'am, this is David Carter. He was born in Ashwood. Left at the hospital 38 years ago." Helen's breath hitched. David watched as her face crumbled. She gripped the doorframe, her knuckles white. "Oh my God." Silence stretched between them, thick with emotion. Then, suddenly, tears streamed down her face. She let out a shaky breath and covered her mouth with her trembling hands. She choked on her words. I never let myself believe I would ever see you again." David's chest tightened. He had spent weeks imagining this moment, playing out every possible scenario in his head. But none of them prepared him for this, for the sheer rawness of standing face to face with the woman who had given birth to him. Helen stepped forward, her eyes searching his face like she was trying to memorize every feature. "You look just like him," she whispered. David frowned. "Like who?" She let out a quiet, tearful laugh. "Your father." His breath caught. It was the first time he had ever heard mention of the man. His real father. But before he could ask more, Helen shook her head, as if trying to steady herself. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, her voice breaking. "David, I am so sorry." David clenched his jaw. For a long moment, he didn't know what to feel. He had thought about this for days, what he would say, how he would react. He had pictured himself angry, shouting, demanding answers. He had imagined himself indifferent, cold, unmoved. But now, standing here, watching the woman who had brought him into this world sob in front of him, he just felt lost. "Why?" His voice was quieter than he intended, but it carried all the weight of his pain. "Why did you leave me?" Helen let out a shaky breath, wiping her tears as if that would stop the flood of emotions from pouring out. She motioned toward the inside of the house. "Please," she said softly. "Let me explain." David sat stiffly on the couch, his hands clasped together, his mind running in circles. Helen sat across from him, still visibly shaken. She took a deep breath before speaking. "I was young," she began. 17. My parents had kicked me out when they found out I was pregnant. I had nothing, David. No money. No home. No way to take care of a baby. David swallowed hard. "I tried," she continued, her voice breaking. "I wanted to keep you. But the night you were born, I was terrified. I had no support, no one to turn to. I held you for hours, trying to convince myself that I could find a way. But deep down, I knew I couldn't give you the life you deserved." She wiped at her tears. "So I did the hardest thing I've ever done." Her voice trembled. "I left you at the hospital, hoping, praying, that someone would take care of you. That you would find a family who could give you everything I couldn't." David sat there, absorbing every word. A part of him wanted to be furious. How could she have given him up so easily? How could she have left him behind, never knowing what happened to him? But another part of him, one he wasn't ready to admit, felt something else. Understanding. Because she had been just a kid. Alone. Scared. With no way to care for a newborn. And by some cruel twist of fate, his adoptive parents, John and Margaret, had been the ones to take him in. His life had been shaped by a decision made decades ago, in a moment of desperation. He exhaled shakily. I spent my whole life thinking I knew who I was, he finally said. And now, I don't know anymore. Helen's face crumpled. You're my son, David. And I never stopped thinking about you. Not for a single day. Her words should have comforted him. But they didn't. Because if she had never stopped thinking about him, why hadn't she ever tried to find him? The question burned on his tongue, but he wasn't sure he was ready for the answer. Instead, he stared down at his hands, his mind still reeling. Helen reached for him, hesitated, then pulled back. I know you probably hate me, she said softly. David looked up. I don't hate you, he admitted. I just don't know what to do with this. Helen nodded, as if she understood completely. And for the first time, David realized maybe she did. David sat alone in his apartment, the weight of everything pressing down on him like an anchor. The last few weeks had been a whirlwind, first discovering he wasn't biologically related to the people he had called mom and dad for 38 years, and then coming face to face with the woman who had given birth to him, only to leave him behind. 2 mothers. 2 worlds. And he was stuck between them. His heart was a battlefield, torn between loyalty and curiosity, between love and pain. He owed his life to John and Margaret. They had raised him, given him a home, loved him as if he were their own flesh and blood. But Helen was a piece of his identity he never knew was missing until now. He wasn't sure what to do with any of it. Days passed, and the storm inside him refused to settle. One evening, he found himself outside his parents' house, his childhood home, the place where he had felt safe, where every Christmas morning and every scraped knee had been met with love. But now, that love felt complicated. He stepped inside. The house smelled the same, like home, but he felt like a stranger in it. John and Margaret were in the living room, their faces tight with worry the moment they saw him. Margaret stood, wringing her hands. David, honey, we didn't know if we'd see you again. He exhaled heavily, rubbing a hand down his face. I don't know if I would have come back if I hadn't needed to. Margaret flinched, and guilt twisted in his gut. He didn't mean it that way. He didn't want to hurt them. But he was hurt. He took a seat across from them, folding his hands together. I met her. John's jaw tightened. Margaret's eyes welled with tears. I met Helen, David clarified. My birth mother. A thick silence filled the room. Margaret slowly sat back down. And? Her voice was barely above a whisper. David stared at the floor, trying to find the words. She told me why she gave me up. How she had nothing. How she was scared. He looked up at them, his emotions raw. She says she thought she was doing the right thing. Margaret wiped at her eyes. Maybe she was. David's breath hitched. He had expected defensiveness, maybe even resentment. But instead, his mother, the woman who had raised him, was trying to understand the one who had left him. He swallowed hard. I don't know how to feel. I'm angry, but at the same time, I get it. I see why she did it. John finally spoke, his voice steady. And what do you want to do, son? David exhaled, his shoulders slumping. I don't know. And that was the truth. He had spent days running through every scenario, every possibility. Did he walk away from Helen and pretend she never existed? Did he let go of his anger and embrace her as part of his life? Did he shut out his parents for keeping the truth from him? None of those options felt right. Because the truth was, he loved John and Margaret. They were his real parents, in every way that mattered. Blood didn't change that. But Helen was part of him, too. She had given him life. And no matter how much he wanted to hate her for leaving, he couldn't ignore the fact that she had been young, alone, and desperate. I don't want to lose either of you, he admitted, looking between them. But I don't want to walk away from her. Margaret's lips trembled, and for a moment, David was terrified she would break down. But instead, she nodded, as if she had already made peace with the idea. I understand, she whispered. David frowned. You do? She gave him a sad smile. Of course I do. We always knew this day might come. That one day, you might go looking for her. And I won't lie, it scares me. Her voice shook. Because I don't want to lose my son. His heart clenched. "You're not losing me, Mom." Margaret let out a breath she had been holding, and David realized something then. This wasn't just painful for him. It was painful for them, too. John leaned forward, his hands clasped together. "David, we love you. Nothing changes that. If you want to know her, to build something with her, we won't stand in your way." David blinked, emotion tightening his throat. For weeks, he had been drowning in confusion, unsure of how to navigate this. But here they were, giving him the space to figure it out, even when it hurt them. He nodded slowly. "I don't know what this will look like. I don't even know what I want from her yet." Margaret reached across the table, taking his hand in hers. "Then take your time." David squeezed her hand, a lump forming in his throat. For the first time in weeks, he felt something resembling peace. He didn't have to choose. He could love the parents who raised him and still get to know the woman who had given him life. Maybe love wasn't about blood. Maybe it was about showing up, about forgiveness, about finding a way forward, even when it hurt. And David was finally ready to take that step. David had spent weeks caught in a storm of emotions: anger, confusion, resentment, and longing. But after many heartfelt conversations, he had come to realize something profound. This wasn't just his pain. Both families, both his mothers, had suffered in their own ways. Margaret had spent 38 years loving him unconditionally, knowing one day he might go searching for the woman who had left him. And Helen had spent those same years carrying the burden of her decision, never knowing if the son she had given away had found happiness. Neither woman had intended to hurt him. Both had loved him in the only ways they knew how. And David was done letting the past control him. It started slowly. Small steps. A phone call here and there with Helen. A few short visits to Ashwood, where she lived. It was awkward at first, neither of them knowing what to say or how to act. But over time, David saw beyond the pain of the past. He saw the woman who had made an impossible choice and had spent decades wondering if she had done the right thing. He wasn't sure what their relationship would look like, but he knew one thing: he didn't want to walk away. At the same time, he made sure Margaret and John knew that nothing would ever change how much he loved them. One night, he sat with his mother, holding her hand. "You're my mom," he told her. "That will never change." Margaret had cried then, but they were tears of relief. It wasn't about choosing between them. It was about making space for both. A month later, David did something he never thought he would. He invited Helen over for dinner. At his parents' house. Margaret had hesitated when he suggested it, but then she smiled, as if she had been waiting for this moment all along. John had simply nodded, clapping a firm hand on his son's shoulder. "We'll set an extra plate," he had said. And so, on a crisp Sunday evening, Helen Dawson sat at the same dining table where David had spent his childhood. The same table where he had celebrated birthdays, where he had done his homework, where he had laughed, cried, and built a life. It should have felt strange, but it didn't. Margaret and Helen were polite at first, but soon, the conversation flowed more naturally. They shared stories, some painful, some funny, some bittersweet. And David sat between them, watching two parts of his world come together. As they ate, he realized how different they were. Margaret, warm and nurturing, always making sure his plate was full. Helen, quiet but observant, stealing glances at him as if still memorizing his face. For the first time, he saw them both. Two mothers. Two pieces of his heart. By the time dessert was served, the tension had melted away. Helen helped clear the dishes, and Margaret sent her home with leftovers, just as she had done for every guest who had ever sat at their table. David stood in the doorway, watching as Helen stepped onto the porch, pausing for a moment before turning to him. "I'm proud of you," she said softly, "for everything you've done, and for letting me be a part of your life." David felt a lump rise in his throat. I think I needed to know you." He exhaled. "But I also needed to know that my life wasn't broken because of what happened." Helen's eyes shimmered. "It never was, David. You had exactly the life you were meant to have." He nodded, knowing she was right. As he stepped back inside, he saw Margaret watching from the dining room. "You okay, sweetheart?" she asked. David smiled. For the first time in weeks, the answer was easy. Yeah, Mom. I really am. And with that, the past was no longer a weight holding him down. It was a story, his story, one filled with pain, but also love. One with an ending that was, finally, his to write.